draft environmental impact statement. Tonight, we will provide information about the draft environmental impact statement with a special focus on 130th and 145th Street station areas. This information is about the environmental impact statement, not the draft plan. And we want to answer any questions you might have. Starting next week will be the first of 2 public hearings where instead of answering the questions, we will be taking your public comment. There will be a matter of public record, and I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. So Patrice, would you like to talk about the station areas?
Sure. Hi, I'm Patrice Carroll from the Office of Planning and Community Development. And it was just about 5 years ago when I first met some of you, when we started talking about the future of the area around the future light rail stations at 130th and 145th Street. So in those years, we've had a lot of different kinds of engagement. We've had some open houses, some workshops. We've had a lot of, during the pandemic, we had some online sessions like this. And eventually there was enough information. Sound Transit was able to move forward with a schedule that they were confident with. And so now we are doing the environmental analysis that will help us to implement zoning, that will implement the community vision that was developed to have a vibrant urban village around the 130th Street station. And again, not to forget that we are also studying and talking about a bus rapid transit station that's going to be constructed on 145th Street and near 15th Avenue. So we did receive a grant from the state to begin to do this analysis that would let us adopt new zoning. And for reasons that you'll see as we go through this, it made a lot of sense to sort of nest this analysis within the broader citywide analysis. It was very difficult just to talk about what would happen immediately around the station without talking about the bigger areas. So on the right, you see just the general kind of the big circles indicating a half-mile area around the 2 light rail stations, and then the smaller area that we're looking at around that BRT station at 145th and 15th Avenue. We're going to start seeing some of that light rail happen. The station at 148th Street is going to be opening in August this year. The 130th station and the BRT station are scheduled for sometime in 2026. So, and this just gives you an overview of the timeline. And so we are kind of at the end of this, what has felt like a very, very long process. And that's why we're here tonight. So, all
right.
Jim is I'm turning it back to my colleague, Jim, who's going to go through just kind of some of the rudimentary basics of environmental impact statements. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Patrice. Environmental impact statement is required by the state of Washington under the State Environmental Policy Act, and it's an analysis of the environmental impacts resulting from a project to the natural and built environment. In this case, that project is the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan. Key part of an environmental impact statement is the comparison of different alternative approaches. So we start with the no action alternative, and what that means is if we change nothing, what will happen? And then we compare that with the action alternatives. And in this case, we have 4 action alternatives, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we look at, in all of those, including the no action, what's going to happen over the next 20 years with as we grow in housing units and jobs. So this is going to 2044, which is the time horizon for the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan. So we looked at several elements of the environment. These are identified during a scoping process that we held last year, which we received numerous public comments on. We looked at impacts to earth and water, to air quality, to plants and animals, to energy and natural resources, to noise, to land use and urban form, plans and policies, population and housing, cultural resources, transportation, public services, and utilities. I'm going to run through the citywide alternatives that we looked at. Then Patrice will talk a bit about the specific 130th, 145th Street station area alternatives that were embedded within these. So as I said, the no action alternative is what happens if we change nothing. It maintains the status quo. And we would expect over the next 20 years, 80,000 new homes and 158,000 new jobs under this alternative. The focused alternative, alternative 2, creates a new neighborhood center designation around existing neighborhood business districts. That's represented by the circles you see on the map. Neighborhood centers could have a range of housing from townhouses to 7-story stacked housing. And in this alternative, we analyze the impacts of 100,000 new homes and 150,000 new jobs over the next 20 years. Alternative 3, the broad alternative, broadens the range of low-scale housing options allowed in all neighborhood residential zones. So that's the lightest purple area you see on the map. And it also anticipates or analyzes the impacts of growth of 100,000 new homes and 158,000 new jobs over the next 20 years. And in this alternative, of those new homes, 20,000 of them are spread throughout that light purple area. Fourth alternative is the corridor alternative. It allows a wider range of housing options in newly designated corridors to focus growth within a short walk of frequent transit and amenities. Housing types in these areas would range from duplexes to 5-story stacked housing or more in existing multifamily and commercial areas. And we also, in this alternative, studied the impacts of 100,000 new homes and 158,000 new jobs. And finally, alternative 5, the combined alternative, we studied the greatest potential growth of 120,000 new homes, 158,000 new jobs over the next 20 years. And it designates Ballard as a regional center. And it combines a number of the strategies from the 3 previous actions, alternatives 2, 3, and 4. And Patrice, you want to talk about station areas?
Yeah, so because we were looking at a smaller area, we were able to kind of zoom in and actually look at some specific zoning using the base zoning that we have now. So this again is the no action alternative. So this is what the zoning is right now. And as you can see, the area around the 130th station is all neighborhood residential. That's the lowest density zone that we have. And then the area around the 145th BRT station has some mid-rise zoning, has some commercial zoning. So there's actually already some development capacity there. Next slide. So this is the next alternative that we studied, and this one is neighborhood anchors, or what we're now calling neighborhood centers. And it was looking at kind of 3 centers in sort of 3 strategic locations in the area. The first being the area that's most accessible to that 130th station. So very close to Fifth Avenue, doesn't really look at an area on the other side of I-5. We also looked at another little center that's close by that's existing where there's a bit of a commercial cluster kind of around the Safeway area at 125th and 15th. And then we also looked at that cluster up at 145th Street where, again, you have some multifamily housing, you have some existing low-scale commercial development there. So again, this would bring more density to each of those areas. Multifamily and mixed-use buildings, and mixed-use buildings where you see the orange color, and then multifamily buildings where you see the brownish colors, and the darker brown being the mid-rise construction, so that would be the most dense, and then the lighter brown areas being various low-rise zones. Next slide. And then this is the other alternative. Oh, and I should say, like, outside of those areas where we have the zoning would be, there still would be change there, but it would be the changes consistent with the citywide new zoning for the neighborhood residential areas. So this is the most dense alternative that we studied, and this is what we call the urban village alternative. But now we'll be calling these urban centers. So again, it looks at much denser development around the 130th Street Station, even stretching across to I-5. Again, a mix of mid-rise and low-rise housing types. So that could be apartment buildings, row houses, townhouses. And then the orange area would be what we call the neighborhood commercial area. So that would be the kind of buildings that you see where there's retail on the first floor and then there's apartments above. So again, it reflects some of the existing zoning, but it certainly expands it, and it does suggest denser zoning in those areas that are now neighborhood residential. And again, there's another little cluster up on 145th, and this is the same configuration that we have in the neighborhood centers alternative. So again, taking advantage of some of the zoning that's already there, the mid-rise zoning, and then expanding the areas for other multifamily zoning a little bit, and then requiring the commercial development there to be more in a pedestrian-oriented form, and that's called our neighborhood commercial zone. And again, so this would mean those dark brown and orange areas would be the places with the most height, and then they would scale down from there.
All right, I am going to run through the elements of the environment that we studied in the draft EIS, including likely impacts and mitigation options that were identified. This is high level, but it gives it's from, you can find a lot of this information on the executive summary to the draft EIS on our website. I also want to tell you that on our website we have a link to a story map, which is a really great way to navigate the EIS and has links to relevant sections after telling where you can find out more detailed information. Whoops. So let's talk about earth and water quality. The analysis found that there would be no significant adverse impacts. The likely impacts are increased development and vehicle travel that could result in discharges to waterways. However, development is subject to current stormwater requirements to avoid that. And further mitigation options are continual updating of the stormwater code requirements, updating environmental critical areas ordinance, as we do every 7 years to be based on best available science, and investing in restoration of natural areas. In the element addressing impacts to air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, it also found that there were no significant adverse impacts that were expected. Likely impacts and outcomes that it found include reduced air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions at a regional scale as more people live near transit, jobs, shops, and services, and in areas with smaller homes. There would be reduced greenhouse gas emissions per capita at a local scale, increased total emissions at a local scale, and temporary emissions from construction activity. The mitigation options that was identified was to promote the use of electric vehicles, updating of energy code requirements, implementing strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, including funding vehicle electrification improvements or improvements to walking, biking, and transit infrastructure, implementing strategies to reduce air toxics near residential areas, and improving air filtration for new buildings. On the element addressing impacts to plants and animals, they found there were no significant adverse impacts expected. The likely impacts and outcomes include that there would be a moderate tree canopy loss on all properties undergoing development within Seattle. Development-related reductions in canopy cover would be reversed over time as replacement trees grow. Alternatives 3 and 5 would result in the largest tree canopy loss due to lower density development in the neighborhood residential zones. And all of the action alternatives, that's 2 through 5, would tend to increase regional tree canopy by focusing growth into urban areas and preventing sprawl. Some of the mitigation options that were identified include implementing incentives to encourage retention and expansion of the tree canopy, using an adaptive management approach to collect, monitor, analyze, and learn from the results of code application, increase funding for tree planting, forest restoration, and green infrastructure, and increasing investment in the equitable distribution and resilience of the urban forest. For energy and natural resources, there were no significant adverse impacts expected. The likely impact and outcomes include increased total energy use at a local scale, decreased per capita energy use at a local scale. Mitigation options include upgrading electrical infrastructure to reduce use of power and increase reliability, and to update building and energy codes to improve energy efficiency. For land use and urban form, there are no significant adverse impacts expected. Likely impacts and outcomes include increased frequency of areas with a mix of uses and heights. There could be some awkward transitions temporarily when older, less intensive development is next to newer, more intense development as redevelopment occurs. There would be additional height and bulk changing views, casting longer shadows and displacing trees. And the mitigation option identified is to implement gradual transitions in the zoning. Population, housing, and employment also saw no significant adverse impacts. Likely impacts and outcomes include an increased housing supply, variety, and affordability, an increased supply of income-restricted housing. Alternative 3 is expected to produce more ownership units. Alternatives 2 and 4 are expected to provide more rental housing. And alternative 5 would produce a mix of ownership and rental units. All of the alternatives would increase the overall number of units and improve housing affordability. Mitigation options identified: implementation of MHA requirements in neighborhood residential zones. MHA stands for Mandatory Housing Affordability. Increasing funding for programs combating commercial and cultural displacement, and strengthening relocation assistance programs. For cultural resources, there is potential for significant adverse impacts, but these can be avoided or minimized with mitigation. These impacts include change, alteration, or loss of architecturally historic buildings, structures, and objects that might be eligible for future designation on local, state, and federal registers. Potential loss or alterations to the physical evidence or tangible evidence of cultural history to culturally important resources. And impacts or damage to archaeological and cultural resources during below-ground work. Mitigation strategies that could minimize these impacts include updating the city-level rehabilitation guidelines and incentives, funding additional historic resource surveys, modifying demolition review process so that historic review occurs even if SEPA thresholds are increased, and funding public education and outreach efforts that integrate holistic histories of impact and of impacted resources in historically marginalized communities. For the transportation element, there is a potential for significant adverse impacts. There would probably be increased travel time due to traffic volumes, increased intersection times on key corridors and in the 130th and 145th Street station areas, an increased number of passenger trips on public transit, increased population in areas with low sidewalk connectivity. Mitigation options include improving transit, bike, and pedestrian system, implementing transportation demand management programs, implementing transit, parking management, and safety strategies, implementing signal timing changes and physical changes such as additional turn pockets, using an adaptive management approach to monitor crowding in partnership with King County Metro, and to modify the notice process so that the Washington State Department of Transportation continues to read notices if the SEPA thresholds are raised. So that was a high-level overview of the impacts and potential mitigation measures. This is information number 2 on April 11th. The first public hearing is going to occur next Wednesday at 10 a.m. The meeting will be held in person and online. It will be in the Bertha K. Landis reception room on the first floor of City Hall. The second public hearing is on Monday, April 22nd at 6 p.m. This meeting will be held online and in person in the Boards and Commissions room in the City Hall on floor L2. And at these meetings, it is an opportunity for you to provide formal comment on the EIS. Relevant to the EIS comments include addressing areas of the analysis you thought were weak or deficient or wrong. Let us know. You also comments on the mitigation measures and should we look at other things. And you can offer your comments, as I said, at the public hearing. You can also offer them online in the form of a written comment. Written comments and comments to the public hearing are equal in weight, so either approach works. What we will do with these comments after the deadline is we will review them. We'll identify all of the issues raised. We'll prepare a response to each comment or each issue raised. And we'll conduct any additional analysis that we need to conduct as a result of those comments. And then they will be published in the final EIS along with any updated analysis. That will be released late in 2024. Once it's released, there will be a 10-day appeal period. If it is appealed, that appeal needs to be resolved before the City Council could act on the comprehensive plan. So either once the appeal period ends and there's no appeal, or after an appeal is resolved, then that is when Council could act on the comprehensive plan. So at this point, we are going to take questions. We welcome your questions in the chat. Also, we will take your questions. If you want to talk, raise your hand, and we will unmute and turn on your microphone, or turn on your camera and unmute you. Okay.
Jim, there was a question in the chat about, is this meeting being recorded?
This meeting is being recorded and we will post it to the website.
Hi, I'm Jesse Hartman with Burke Consulting. I'm going to be kind of helping get people muted and unmuted and watching for the raised hands. We've been helping support on the EIS. So there's a few questions in the chat coming in about what is the preferred alternative, and then are the mitigation options required actions?
So there is no preferred alternative in the draft EIS. That will be in the final EIS, and that will reflect the final plan proposal, which will be developed after the comment period on the concrete draft plan concludes. So you will see the preferred alternative at that point. Mitigation options are not required. The whole structure of SEPA and environmental impact statement process is that we need to identify the impacts and things that decision makers could do to mitigate those impacts. There's no requirement, but it shows a range of options they can adopt when they take an action.
Thanks. The next question is there a key available for what the different zoning categories represent?
I could take that question. So the figures that we that we showed you on those slides, there is on the 130th and 145th website, there is something called a scoping report, and that will give you much more detail about what each of those zones are, and generally like what kind of buildings are developed within those zones. Yeah, so that's a good resource if you want to dig into some of the details on what does neighborhood commercial mean without having to go to the zoning code.
And I think you've actually kind of answered this. So Paul, if you have more questions around the detailed map of zone changes and actually, I guess, can we find a detailed map of the zone changes and timeline? There's a little more to that than just the detailed map. And then Mark and Jan, I'll move to you next.
So are you talking about a detailed map of the station areas or of the whole city?
That's not clear in the question, but maybe we can start with the station areas and then.
Yeah, Patrice, is there a detailed map of the zones with the alternatives? I believe you showed it one on the slide. I will place this presentation on the website too, and you will see the maps of the station areas with the zones of the different alternatives studied. And there's a question in there. There's a few questions to address the issue of a future detailed zoning map. And that work will be done in the second phase over the course of this summer, and you will see those maps before a final or with a final plan proposal.
All right, Mark and Jan, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hammerland, and I was pleased to see that the EIS, excuse me, is far without significant adverse impacts. One mentioned, Jim, one thing that you mentioned was connectivity associated with Proposal 5, Plan 5, and I have a proposal for that. Particularly, I'm thinking about the section of 140 road between Corliss and First Northeast. It's a section on your map that shows development. So I'm thinking about an urban village development there. Some of the problems with low walkway connectivity, building sidewalks along that part of Roosevelt Way, all the way over to Aurora. You have room owning 40 feet of right of way. You have room to build sidewalks and to build pedestrian passage on Roosevelt Way. So you facilitate cycling and safe pedestrian transit to the light rail station.
Well, thank you for that idea. I think it's really important that you put that in the form of a comment to submit either at a public hearing or on our website, so that can be part of the final EIS.
All right, there's the next comment. Our question is, which of these alternatives have received the most public support, pushback, or pushback, and from which sources?
Well, I think we have to wait till the comment period closes on May 6th to be able to answer that question. But I can tell you from the open houses, we've heard comments all over the place.
All right, I think I've got two questions on kind of tree canopy. So one is, canopy reduction seems like an ongoing issue. How is it demonstratable that this can be reversed? And then kind of a follow-up that what is the expected potential loss of tree canopy over time within the 130th urban village area?
You want to try that one, Brennan?
Yeah, sure. I'm Brennan Staley, also with the Office of Planning and Community Development. I'm the lead for the growth strategy and zoning implementation part of the plan. So, first of all, I'd say the EIS studies the impact of a potential proposal. It is not the place where we kind of develop proposals about how to deal with canopy citywide, et cetera. So, the EIS does not really get into what is our plan citywide. Instead, that is in the urban forest management plan, which is available online, and that kind of has the high level goals and policies and then specific strategies that we're using to try and meet that. On the second one, I think it was about whether there's a number of a percentage of canopy loss in the 138th area. No, the EIS looks at a lot of different factors and changes, but it stops short of actually coming up with a specific number of expected canopy before and after. And the major reason for that is that we have a lot of canopy data about what's happened in the past, but we've actually just gone through the process of significantly updating our tree regulations, so we don't have any data about what happens during development under the new regulations.
Thanks, Brennan. The next question is, do zoning changes affect property taxes on homes within the rezoned areas?
I'm happy to take that, Jim.
Please do.
So property taxes are complicated. Changing the zoning of your property does not by itself change your property taxes. However, if the zoning occurs and then over time there's a demonstration that other properties are selling for more because of that rezone, that could impact property taxes over time. At the same time, however, the city has a 1% property tax lid. So if the value of properties across the city go up by 10%, then the percentage has to actually change so that across the board, property taxes are not going up more than 1%. This is separate from levies. Levies obviously are something entirely different. And so what that might mean, if there's a specific localized rezone and that results over time in a demonstration that the properties are worth a lot more, then that could increase your property tax rate. But if there's a kind of a large change like we're doing to neighborhood residential zones across the city, that will not tend to do it, because if all properties are going up in value, then that 1% property tax lid will mean that the property percentages have to go down so that it remains relatively flat. So all very that's the complicated, but that's how it tends to work.
All right, the next one is if increased urban heating due to higher density has been addressed in the EIS.
I'm going to throw this to Burke. The greenhouse gas section, I believe, addresses urban heating.
I believe it's in the land use patterns and urban form section. There's also some other reference to it in energy, I believe, and utilities as well.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm kind of hopping around in the questions a little bit. I think there's two on eminent domain and whether those will be used to upzone in the neighborhood. Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, we will not be using eminent domain. The city of Seattle doesn't have that power to do that. I mean, for big public works projects, I think they do, but I know some cities have used eminent domain to change development patterns. That is not something we do, can do, will do, want to do. These changes allow what people can make decisions about what to do with their property, to the degree that a future upzone allows them to build more dense housing or sell their property to someone who wants to do. That's their decision to do so or not to do so.
Okay. Will you need to do another EIS if the community and council prefer higher zoning than you've proposed?
No, but it depends. So the most dense alternative that we studied was alternative 5. So they have latitude to take an action that does anything up to that level of alternative 5. If they want to exceed what's in alternative 5, then we would probably need to do what's called a supplemental EIS to provide additional information and comment time to this EIS.
I think we're going to jump back to trees a little bit, but there's a lack of sidewalks in this urban village proposal. What is the time frame for adding sidewalks with trees?
This is a high-level plan for growth over the next 20 years and identifies building more sidewalks and tree planting as mitigation actions. Those are really part of a capital plan that SDOT would need to prepare. They've just recently issued, and Council's considering, the Seattle Transportation Plan, which will be followed by a levy that does include some increased sidewalks. I can't speak to it. I would refer you to that document, though.
I'm not sure there's much follow-up to this question, but just noting that some of the maps are hard to read and wondering if they'll have major street names and roads added. And I think that would be a great comment to put formally, and then just also a reminder to us as we're preparing the final documents. So next question, why do you not propose a zoning increase along 145th similar to what Shoreline has enacted?
Yeah, so this is an EIS. We studied alternatives, different scenarios. None of them include that height similar to what Shoreline has done. That's the information from this information session. But if you think we should, the next step is to make a comment on the EIS that we should analyze the impacts of the increased height on the south side of 145th, and that would free council to be able to take an action to do that if we did the analysis for that.
Yeah, and I can just add that, you know, we did have the big circle that around the 145th station that showed a big area west of I-5 near 145th. But when the actual station location was determined, it was a little bit further north and a little bit further east. And given the street patterns that are proposed for that corridor, when SDOT did their walkshed studies, there was very few parcels west of I-5 on 145th that would be within that 10-minute walk. I know it looks close, but it's going to be a bit of a slog. So that was our decision not to look at changes in that area.
Next question is, what is the zoning for the Jackson Park Golf Course, and how would development in the surrounding areas potentially affect it?
Well, it is neighborhood residential zoned, which used to be single family, but it is parkland, so it cannot be developed. It cannot be redeveloped unless some similar amount and quality of park space can be found in the vicinity to replace it. The EIS, particularly when in the sections that drill down to 130th and 145th, looks at the impacts in the general area. That includes the golf course. So, for example, when it's looking at impacts on plants and animals, it looks at plants and animals in that area, which includes the golf course. So I would refer you to the EIS and the different sections of the environment, the ones that you might be most interested in.
Yeah, and I'll also add that this question came up a lot when we were doing the station area plans, is that the most environmentally sensitive areas of the golf course are the areas that are closest to the transit station. So again, there's a lot of stormwater infrastructure in that area. The Thornton Creek runs through that area. So those would also be additional issues if there was a desire to, but Parks has no plans to reuse those lands for anything other than park uses.
Next question is, how has homelessness factored into these alternatives as an outcome?
There is no specific analysis of homelessness other than we expect the population to grow and we want to provide more housing for that population. It is ideally, as more housing is built and housing becomes more affordable, that will help address the components of the homelessness problem that relates to unaffordable housing.
Okay, back to trees. I'm trying to kind of pull a couple comments together here. The current tree regulations allow developers free rein to cut trees. How can this be mitigated? Specifically if these areas, specifically in these areas, sorry, not deflected to citywide, or not sure what that is meant to be there. I think it's a typo, but how can this be mitigated? And then, sorry, there was a follow-up here. We'll start there and I'll try to find the other comment. Apologies.
You want to handle that, Brandon?
Yes. So obviously the first part of that is a comment. So thank you for your comment. In terms of the question, so I guess so currently there are a number of regulations that that regarding trees that we have during development. We have a tree protection code which requires certain trees to be preserved in certain cases. We also have requirements, street tree requirements, both that they have to be preserved unless there's SDOT, the Department of Transportation, that is, says there's no way to preserve them. And then if there are none in place, new ones have to be added. There's also tree planting requirements for new development. So I guess the EIS did not look at whether we should change our regulatory framework. It was fairly recently updated. So yeah, but I guess I can't conjecture about all the ways we might want to update it as part of a future work.
Kind of a follow-up to that is, could developers of multi-story apartments be required to add sidewalks and trees as part of the zoning changes?
Yeah, so currently in centers, such as we're proposing here, a new development that adds any new dwelling units has to also include new sidewalks. So it's expected that the development in this area will also have new sidewalk infrastructure. And new development also is required to add street trees if they don't exist. And so we would also expect that would kind of increase the street tree presence as well.
Okay, switching gears, do any of the alternatives not include the citywide zoning changes that allow greater density in neighborhoods that are currently single family?
No.
Well, sorry,
Oh, no
Tim,
action. Yeah.
Just to be clear, yeah, there are, but also some of the alternatives look at different things. There's the focused alternative looks at just doing neighborhood centers and not the broader ones. The corridor affects some of neighborhood residential areas, but not all of them. Other than no action, they all touch at least a little bit of neighborhood residential zone, but only two actually rezone all of our neighborhood residential zones. I will say, as an aside, since we started this, the state has passed a new law that requires us to update our neighborhood residential zone. So regardless of the EIS alternatives, we are going to have to update our neighborhood all of our neighborhood residential zones as part of this process. The comp plan update, generally, that is.
Has Lakeside School weighed in at all regarding zoning changes? I understand they asked to be excluded. I assume that means excluded from the station area discussion.
I'm not familiar with any comments from them personally.
So we have reached out to Lakeside School since they are a large landowner in the station area. We have not received any comments from them as of yet.
What specific relocation assistance improvements would help insulate some of the negative outcomes of some of these plans?
I mean, there are programs to help relocate people who are displaced at certain affordability levels, and that's about as specific as I can get. But if you were to go to the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections or the Office of Housing website, they could talk about the different programs that they have.
I'll just add that in the past, a couple of things that people have, so we have it's called the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance, and it provides payment to low-income households when they have to move because a building is demolished or or there's an addition or anything like that. In the past, people have looked at either lowering the threshold for when somebody is considered low income or increasing the amount of money. Those are the kind of the two, I think, things that have come up in past work.
Will upzoning eliminate off-street parking on what would be a parking strip if sidewalks are mandated? Lots of people in my neighborhood park in these areas, which technically are outside of their property lines. We presently don't have sidewalks.
So as I was saying, new development will be required to put in new sidewalks. In many cases, they will also be required to put in curbs. Obviously, to the extent that sidewalks are put in or curbs are put in, you can't, park on sidewalks, and you can't, obviously wouldn't even want to try and park over a curb. But the specifics, improvements that would happen on a site-by-site basis might vary. Generally, most streets in our city, especially kind of non-arterial streets, have parking, even with curbs on one or both sides. So all that is to say, no, you wouldn't obviously be able to park on the sidewalk or the curb, but traditionally, the designs that we're seeing, generally have parking on the street instead. So that parking tends to be preserved, but it would be on a case-by-case basis, or rather, street-by-street basis.
Yeah, and there may be other changes to the on-street parking regulations, because there will be a light rail station there. SDOT generally begins a study like that a year or a year and a half before a station opens, and usually make parking time limited. Often have a resident restricted parking for residents, that kind of thing. So again, that study hasn't happened yet, but that will be coming as well.
What is the plan for increasing sewer and electric grid infrastructure?
Well, I can tell you that this analysis of utilities for the different growth scenarios and the alternatives, that there were no constraints, capacity constraints for those for sewer and for electrical systems. But when there are constraints, you don't issue development permits, until you can make the investments to improve the system. But so that was the EIS finding. In terms of long-term planning for infrastructure, I think I would refer you to the capital facilities element of the draft plan, which is once again a different animal than the draft EIS, and but it talks about what the city is planning to do over the next 20 years.
I'll just add that Seattle Public Utilities is developing a program called Shape Our Waters, and looking at how they want to improve their system over long term as well. The City Light also is, has a more continuous model for upgrading their systems. And those are responsible kind of doing the system-wide improvements. And then obviously there's also connections to the system, and there's an expectation that when a development comes in, if they need to improve their connection, that they would do that on a kind of on a project by project basis.
And this is just a comment to note and follow-ups that there are electrical system issues in Pinehurst now, and City Light is addressing these, and they just to reach out to City Light to discuss those. So I think that's a comment to follow up on.
Brendan, this is Lisa Greeter with Burke. I think there's some maps in the utilities section that are worth looking at, that SPU has provided, and Seattle City Light regarding capacity constrained areas and areas of priority improvements that were taken into account.
And I think there's just some sounds like there are people who would like to talk to you about the electrical system issues. So I would encourage those folks to go through the kind of formal comment process so that we can make sure you get in touch. So the next question is, some people are advocating for 200,000 new housing units in the city. Is that off the table because it wasn't considered in this draft DIS?
Well, what's considered in this draft EIS is based on the state forecasts of growth to the year 2044, our share of that state forecast for regional growth. The actual zone capacity that exists today can accommodate that. So the better way to think of this is a floor of what could happen. This is what this plan is legally required to evaluate. It's not a cap on how much growth can occur, though.
Is there any expectation that 130th and or 145th would need to be widened, thereby requiring taking portions of private property for the widened street?
Yeah, there's no one here from SDOT tonight, but SDOT is currently studying the 130th corridor and designing improvements to that corridor. So perhaps I'll look and see if I can find a link to that webpage. The 145th corridor is quite complicated because there's many owners there. The city owns part of it, the city of Shoreline owns part of it, the Washington Department of Transportation owns part of it. As far as I know, the city of Seattle is not supportive of converting additional land to improve capacity of that corridor. So they're more interested in safety improvements and things like that. I think there is some widening happening on the Shoreline side.
This one is, I think, more of a comment, just that during heavy traffic times, walk signals don't always work, and that make it worse with increased traffic. So something to just be aware of. Sorry, go ahead, Patrice. Oh, sorry, your name lit up, so I thought I was cutting you off. With the new state requirements for zoning, how are the assumptions about infrastructure demands due to higher population, environmental impacts, and mitigation options accounted for?
Can I take that, Brandon?
So, obviously, Seattle City Light manages our electrical infrastructure. Seattle Public Utilities does our water infrastructure. And they have a system, again, they do plans, kind of looking at the long term, and they also do kind of continuous modeling according to those plans. We've been working with them. They're well aware of, changing, that we're proposing to change zoning, and we've been kind of giving them those forecasts, and they've been using those forecasts in addition to the kind of the adaptive management planning process they have to to kind of assess what this means. I can't, obviously we rely on their technical expertise. It's not a process we do, so I can't really say much deeper than that, but again, yeah, they're well aware of all these of the zoning that potentially is changes that may occur.
So can I follow up to that 200,000 housing unit question? Is just, doesn't alternative 5 have that level of increased zoned capacity?
It may. We haven't quite done a detailed estimate yet, but I believe it probably comes very close if it doesn't do it.
Actually, I'm going to skip. It looks like some people are having trouble that the link isn't working to the meeting. So I think maybe I'm going to copy the meeting invite again, but I'll come back to that in the chat. How is housing quality measured in these plans? for example, expecting people to live in residential garages converted into ADUs versus apartments.
Maybe I'll just say that, this plan doesn't make assumptions about the extent to which people are doing things like living in unique situations like garages or ADUs. We definitely do have predictions about like the extent is this apartments versus attached homes or detached homes. But again, the goal is to create more housing so people have more options. But if you're looking for something different, I guess I don't. I may have to rephrase the question.
From where we stand today, how long before we would realistically expect to see changes in these neighborhoods?
I can take that. So at the zoning proposal for 130th and 145th station areas is kind of ahead of other things. So we're hearing comments right now on the draft plan, the growth strategy. We're going to use those comments to actually create a zoning proposal for the city as a whole and put that out in October. Once we've done that, then we will start the process of actually creating legislation that would make zoning changes. We will plan to send those zoning changes to council in 2025. We hope that they can adopt it in 2025, but there's some chance that maybe it might get split in two phases, or it might all go to 2026. But we hope there'd be an adoption in 2025 or 2026. Then once then usually there's a month or 3 months before it's effective, and at that point, then people can start submitting permit applications that meet the new code. And obviously, for people that there's generally kind of a planning process that they may do ahead of time, but then it takes generally like a 6 months to a year to get a permit. And then it takes a couple of years to construct, depending on the scale of things. So probably the very first units probably won't be coming on until late 2027 or 2028. We also envision this change is going to be very incremental. The vast majority of sites will, well, depending on where it is, or things won't develop. And so over in the near term, so it's going to be the change itself will probably be very gradual over time.
With light rail expanding, perhaps we can pump the brakes a bit on new housing until some of these concerns are addressed. That's kind of more of it's a comment and also a question in a little bit of a way. I'm not sure if there's much to say on that, Brennan. Sorry.
Yeah,
I mean, housing is occurring, growth is occurring. That is not something we're making happen or can really stop. It is just, we are a growing city.
Yeah, I think that the people are here, and the question is, do we produce housing for those people? But certainly we could put forward a plan that results in less housing or more housing based on how we choose to do the zoning proposal. And that's kind of one of the kind of the questions we're looking for feedback on, not as part of the EIS, but as far as the plan itself.
There's a kind of follow-up that wouldn't increased housing density synergize well with increased transit?
Yeah, we the city tend to try and locate housing near transit because obviously, it's a real amenity for people who live in those homes to be able to use transit. Also, it is much easier to live with either no cars or fewer cars if you have those options. We also try and locate people near shops and services and amenities as well. So that is a goal for the city.
Patrice, this question is for you. Was the walk time for the 148th station to west of 145th station to west of I-5 using the future pedestrian bike bridge over I-5 to the station?
So I just I just posted a link to the SDOT study that shows the walk sheds for the two stations. I don't believe it used the pedestrian bridge. The pedestrian bridge actually takes you further north. So I'm not sure that is certainly provides better access to folks in Shoreline. I'm not sure it has much impact providing access to folks who live south of 145th.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. I apologize if I've missed them coming in. Please just put them in there again, or if folks want to speak, they can still raise their hand as well.
Patrice, is there an upcoming comprehensive plan open house in the proximate to the station area?
You're muted, Patrice.
I don't have the list in front of me. It's there. There is one coming up at the Eckstein Middle School. That would be the closest. Oh, I can look it up and post a link to it in the chat.
So I'd like to address the questions or comments we're getting about the difficult links. Really, we sincerely apologize. Obviously, these links are working for some people. I do not know why there would be difficulty, but we are available throughout this comment period to answer any questions people may have. Either through the EIS email on the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan website, or any of us individually. And once again, the 25th at Eckstein would be a great opportunity also to talk about the station area. I'm not sure why the links aren't working, but I believe that obviously there's something we need to look into.
There was also just a question about where to submit written comments, and I think we'll get that put into the chat in just a minute here. The next question is just, I'm still hung up on the mitigation options are just that options part. If there are impacts that aren't mitigated, that could affect support for an alternative. Am I misunderstanding something?
The mitigation options are for decision makers to adopt. So we give them a menu of actions they can take to mitigate impacts.
And it looks like Lisa added the story map with the comment form. And then there's also, you can pull it from the EIS. Oh, thanks, Lisa. There's the email if you'd want to submit written comments that way, or if you want to do a good old fashioned letter, there's a address you can mail them to as well.
Are there any other questions that we can answer tonight? All right, well, thank you. Once again, we're available for your questions. Look forward to your comments on the EIS. And
Sorry, can I just make a request for
Yeah.
Renee? If you know somebody who's not being able to get in, if you could have them take a picture of what error message they're getting or something, because obviously
Yeah.
without some information, there's no way we can figure out why some people would be able to use a link and other people wouldn't. So if you could try and get somebody to like take a picture, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
All comments that we receive will be published, and our response to them. That is what will be in the final EIS. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.